Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're diving deep into algorithmic fairness. And actually, this paper kind of starts a little bit provocatively.
Yeah.
So it says, some experts are saying that perfect fairness in algorithms might be impossible. So before we all kind of descend into this dystopian sci-fi world where the robots are making all the decisions and they're all unfair, let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah. Right.
Let's figure out why that might be and, more importantly, what we could do about it.
Yeah. And this is a really important paper, I think, for anyone making decisions.
Absolutely.
Especially, those of you leading organizations, managing teams, because we live in this world where algorithms are making more and more decisions. They're everywhere.
Loan approvals, job applications, risk assessments.
Criminal justice system.
Yeah, all over the place. So we need to figure this fairness thing out. The paper kind of starts out by talking about two main ideas about fairness in algorithms, and they call them sufficiency and separation.
Yeah, two of the most popular, criteria that people talk about when they think about algorithmic fairness.
Okay, so let's say an algorithm is trying to predict your chances of success in college. So sufficiency means that if the algorithm says you're likely to succeed, your actual chances of success should be the same, no matter what your race, gender, or other factors are.
Yeah, it's basically saying, the outcome shouldn't be influenced by those attributes once the algorithm has made its prediction.
So that prediction might be based on all sorts of data,
Sure.
but the result shouldn't disadvantage anyone unfairly. Okay.
Yeah.
So separation.
Separation's a little bit different. It's saying the algorithm's prediction itself shouldn't be influenced by things like race or gender, given the actual outcome. So if you're actually going to succeed in college, the algorithm should have the same chance of predicting that success, regardless of your background.
So it's like we're looking at fairness from two different angles. So this paper is really looking at why is it so hard to get both of those right at the same time?
Yeah, and they're not the first to point this out. This is kind of an ongoing thing in the fairness literature.
There's tension.
A lot of tension between these criteria. And actually, what the paper calls out are what are called the impossibility results.
Impossibility results.
Yeah.
So tell me about those a little bit more.
So these are basically mathematical proofs that show that achieving both sufficiency and separation perfectly is almost impossible in most real-world situations.
That sounds a little disheartening. Yeah.
It can be, and it sparked a lot of debate. Among researchers, among practitioners. But what's really interesting about this paper, I think, is it kind of takes a step back and says, okay, instead of getting bogged down in whether or not this is impossible, is it mathematically provable that we can achieve both of these things at the same time? They say, what's feasible? What can we actually do? We actually make fairness happen, even if it's not perfect right away. That, I think, is the much more practical question for leaders.
Yeah.
Because if you accept that it's impossible, then what are you going to do?
Right. You just give up.
Right. Just throw your hands up.
Yeah.
So instead they say, what can we actually make happen?
Okay. So how does this paper approach feasibility then?
They start by breaking things down into hard and soft constraints.
Okay.
So hard constraints are kind of like the laws of physics. You just can't change them. For example, algorithms are always going to have some degree of error.
Okay, so that's a reality we just have to live with. What about the soft constraints?
So the soft constraints are the obstacles that we can overcome, even if it takes time and effort. And they highlight one of the biggest ones, which is base rate inequality.
Okay, remind me what that is.
So base rate inequality basically means different groups have different starting points in the data. For example, if historical data already shows disparities in loan repayment rates based on certain zip codes, trying to achieve both sufficiency and separation becomes a lot harder.
Oh, so even if the algorithm itself isn't biased, it's working with data that already reflects existing inequalities.
Exactly. And this is where the paper argues that leaders and decision makers have a really crucial role to play.
So what can leaders do then? Is it just about tweaking the algorithms themselves? Or
It's much bigger than that. This paper is calling for a much broader, more systemic approach to fairness.
Okay.
So yes, we need to develop better algorithms,
Right.
but we also need to tackle the root causes of inequality that feed into the data.
So it's not enough to just fix the algorithm. You need to fix the world around it.
Exactly. You got to fix the world around it. This is a big ask,
It is.
but that's what the paper is arguing for. And this is where they say, true algorithmic fairness is a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey that everyone, especially leaders, needs to be actively involved in.
Okay, so the paper uses a specific case study the Compass Recidivism Risk Assessment Tool. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So this is a tool that's been used in the criminal justice system to predict the likelihood that someone who's been arrested will commit another crime. And it's been at the center of a lot of controversy because some people argue that it's biased against certain racial groups. So the paper uses this as an example of just how complex algorithmic fairness can be when we're dealing with these existing inequalities in the data.
So it's a real-world illustration of these impossibility results. We can't just make the algorithm perfectly fair if the data itself
reflects these
deeper societal issues.
So we really need to think about that. And this is where the paper's focus on dynamic duties of justice comes in.
Dynamic duties of justice. It's a mouthful.
It's basically a fancy way of saying that our responsibility to ensure fairness evolves as the world changes.
Okay, I can see how that's relevant here.
Yeah.
As algorithms get more powerful, as we learn more about their potential impact, our responsibility to kind of address those impacts grows too.
Right. It's not a static thing.
Okay.
You can't just set fairness guidelines and then forget about them. The paper's stressing that leaders need to be constantly reevaluating and adapting their approach.
That makes sense, but it also sounds like a huge challenge.
It is.
How can leaders actually stay on top of all of this?
Well, the paper argues for a socio-technical approach.
Socio-technical approach.
It's kind of a jargony term, but what it basically means is understanding how algorithms interact with the social systems and structures that they're operating within.
So it's not just looking at the algorithm in isolation.
Right.
It's looking at
the whole context that it's operating in.
Okay, and that context includes things like...
Well, it could include all sorts of things. So think about how an algorithm used for hiring decisions might actually reinforce existing biases in the workplace if we're not careful.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're not just talking about, is this algorithm biased in itself? We're talking about how that algorithm plays out in a very complex system.
Exactly, yeah, and interacts with all these other social factors.
And this is where I think the concept of intersectionality comes in.
Yeah, intersectionality is really important here.
Remind me what that means.
So intersectionality basically means that we need to consider how different forms of disadvantage, like race, gender, socioeconomic status, can intersect and create unique experiences of oppression.
Okay, so for example, an algorithm used to predict loan defaults might have a very different impact on a single mother from a low-income background compared to a wealthy white male applicant, even if the algorithm itself is technically neutral.
Right. Fairness isn't a one-size-fits-all concept. It needs to be tailored to the specific context.
Got it.
And the individuals who are involved.
Okay, so we've talked about, these impossibility results.
Right.
We've talked about this idea of dynamic duties of justice that leaders need to embrace. What about solutions?
So what can we actually do about this?
Yeah, does the paper offer any concrete guidance on what organizations can actually do?
It does. So it argues that it's not just about tweaking algorithms to mitigate bias. It's about tackling the root causes of inequality in the real world.
So it's a much broader approach than just focusing on the technical aspects of the algorithm itself.
Much broader, yeah.
Okay.
So this might involve things like investing in education, promoting economic opportunity, reforming systems that perpetuate disadvantage.
So really looking at those systemic issues that are contributing to these inequalities in the first place. Are there any specific examples of how organizations can put these ideas into practice?
Yeah, so think about a company that's using an algorithm for hiring decisions. They could start by carefully auditing their existing data for bias, not just in the algorithm itself, but in the historical hiring practices that generated that data.
So they need to look at that whole system, not just the algorithm in isolation.
Exactly.
But what could they actually do if they find evidence of bias?
Well, they could implement bias mitigation techniques in the algorithm itself, but they could also take steps to diversify their applicant pool, provide bias training to hiring managers, and even restructure their hiring process to minimize the impact of subjective judgments.
So it's a multi-pronged approach that combines technical solutions with organizational and even societal changes.
It's all connected. And the paper emphasizes that this is an ongoing process. It requires constant monitoring, evaluation, adjustment.
I can see how this would be particularly relevant for, leaders, administrators, managers.
Absolutely.
People who are responsible for making decisions that affect people's lives.
Yeah, the paper highlights the importance of not just technical expertise, but also ethical awareness, commitment to social responsibility.
So it's not enough to just understand how the algorithms work.
Right.
Leaders need to understand the potential consequences of their use, take proactive steps to ensure fairness.
And this requires a shift in mindset.
It's about seeing algorithmic fairness as not just a legal obligation, but a moral imperative.
A moral imperative, exactly. And the paper encourages leaders to embrace this challenge with a sense of cautious optimism. It acknowledges the difficulties, but also highlights the potential for progress if we're willing to put in the effort.
So it's not about throwing our hands up and saying fairness is impossible.
Right.
It's about rolling up our sleeve and working towards it.
Exactly.
Even if it's a long and complex journey.
And remember, this isn't something that any one person or organization can solve on their own. The paper stresses the importance of collaboration. So researchers, policymakers, technologists, community members all need to work together to develop solutions that are both effective and ethical.
It's a call to action for all of us to recognize that algorithmic fairness is a shared responsibility. So as we're kind of wrapping up our deep dive into this paper, what are some key takeaways that our listeners, especially those in leadership roles, can really take to heart?
I think the biggest one is that algorithmic fairness isn't a box you check. It's a constant process of evaluation and improvement. Think of it like tending a garden. You can't just plant the seeds and walk away. You have to nurture those plants and adjust your approach as they grow.
Yeah, and we're not just looking for a quick fix.
Right.
We're talking about like a fundamental shift.
Yeah, a shift in mindset.
And how we approach algorithms and their impact on society.
Absolutely. And part of that shift involves recognizing that fairness isn't one size fits all. It's complex and nuanced, and we need to consider how different groups are affected by these technologies. And this is where leaders have a really crucial role to play. They need to be asking tough questions about whose values are embedded in these algorithms, who benefits from their use, and who might be harmed. It's about moving beyond those really simplistic notions of fairness as balance and really grappling with the deeper ethical implications. Leaders need to be open about how algorithms are being used in their organizations and be willing to engage in dialogue with stakeholders about potential concerns.
So it's not just about developing and deploying these technologies. It's also about creating a culture of open communication and collaboration around their use.
Exactly. And this includes involving diverse voices in the design and development process.
So you're not just trying to kind of fix it after the fact.
Exactly. You want to bake fairness in from the start.
If we want to create algorithms that are fair and equitable, we need to make sure that the people creating them have a broad range of perspectives.
A diversity of viewpoints. And this ties back to the paper's emphasis on a socio-technical approach. Right. It's not just about the technical aspects of the algorithm itself, but about how it interacts with the social and political context in which it's being used.
So keep diving deep, fellow learners. Stay curious, ask those tough questions, and let's work together to build a world where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
Well said.
That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.